What is going on, everyone, and welcome back to the channel for another Battlefront 2 video. This is the follow-up to my previous video, the Heroes Best Star Cards Guide. This is going to be the Villains version, and the Villains are actually pretty easy because there's only 5 of them that I recommend swapping cards out depending on the mode you're in, whether it's Heroes versus Villains or Hero Showdown, or Supremacy and Galactic Assault. Those two I kind of group together. Anyway, let's jump into the video, and our first villain here is Boba. And the star cards I recommend are this Quick Refill, the Fuel Efficiency, and the Focalize. I do occasionally recommend swapping out for Extended Exposure, just because when you have the, well, let's look at it, for the Hunt active, not only does it reveal enemies around Boba, to not just him but his whole team, it also allows his jetpack to burn, like you can fly up in the air without actually burning through your fuel, so you can fly significantly longer. And if you have an additional 6 seconds with that ability active, it makes you a lot harder to kill, because let's say you're in a bad situation and you need to fly away, you can just do that with your For the Hunt ability with those extra 6 seconds. Now the jetpack is the thing that you want to focus on mostly, so that's why these two cards are in the mix. However, this one you can exchange here and there because the that 1 meter radius, 1 meter radius isn't too big of a deal. It's kind of hard to hit within 1 meter. 1 meter is relatively big, but it is hard to hit when you're flying around. It's much easier if you're just standing still and just aiming like that. But that 10 plus damage is very effective, especially since you're shooting 3 rockets rather than just 1. Anyway, that's going to be it for Boba. Now, moving on to Bossk, he actually has some different cards that I recommend per situation. So, Supremacy and Galactic Assault, I recommend the Trap Arming Speed for sure. And then you also want Spreading the Disease, because you want that Dioxis Grenade to be as big as possible. Then you also want that Dioxis Grenade to last as long as possible. So Lingering Dioxis is the third one that I recommend, and that's specifically for Supremacy and Galactic Assault. However, you can occasionally swap out for Name Your Poison. That is a good one because you regain health while in that Dioxis Grenade. Dioxis is the big thing that you want to focus on when you're going through Supremacy and other infantry trooper based combat game modes. Now, for Hero Showdown and Heroes versus Villains, you want to stick with these 3: the arming speed, the thicker Dioxis, and then the longer lasting Dioxis. But you, instead of swapping out the healing in your Dioxis card, you may want to swap out for multi-traps, and that's just so you throw out 5 of those detonite charges rather than the 3 that it normally is. And if you're going to swap it out, I recommend keeping the Trap Arming Speed and maybe swapping out Spreading the Disease or even Lingering Dioxis. But I'll typically swap out the thicker Dioxis card before the one that makes it last longer. And that's it for Bossk. Moving on to Vader. Vader is a pretty easy, I should say, villain to use, not hero, in the sense that you can't really go wrong. All of these star cards are incredible, and I personally think Vader should get nerfed, but he is how he should be. You know, like in the movies, he is overpowered. In this game, it's no different. When I make my top 22 heroes and villains list, when I rank them, I will probably end up putting Vader among the top 3, just because he is that ridiculously good. But this is about the star cards, so the 3 that I typically use most often are the bonus health, the Surrounded by Fear, and the Deflection Stamina. And the Deflection Stamina is just so useful because you can slowly walk up while blocking tons of bullets, and then get up there, and with the Surrounded by Fear, every time you kill them, you get 20% of your stamina back, which is such a big help because his stamina does recharge pretty slow, but he has quite a bit of it to last. And then that maximum health increase. Who doesn't want 150 extra hit points, right? Like it's crazy good. However, for Heroes versus Villains, you may want to swap out and stick with the Furious Resilience, keep that bonus health on, and then you also want that surrounded by fear because you want to gain that stamina back in heroes versus villains. However, you may want a intensified lightsaber throw instead, because they did nerf the heck out of the lightsaber throw, so that could be something that helps you out. Or even the fueling the rage, because the damage penalty isn't too big, and you want to keep that that extra health that focused rage gives you for as long as possible. And that's it for Vader. Moving on to Palpatine. We have a very easy hero to use here. He's very similar to Vader in the sense that it doesn't take a whole lot to get to learn him, and once you figure out how to use him, he is very, very good to use. So the three that I typically stick with in the infantry-based game modes is Lightning Reach. You want as far of a range as possible with his basic two-hand attack. You also want the Chain Lightning, can bounce to more targets. That is so essential. Going from, I think the default is like 8. So when you apply his Chain Lightning, which is that left ability, it will bounce to targets within reach of other targets that have already been shocked. That's pretty good because it'll take them down to half health or a little bit lower than half health, depending on which character they're playing as, and then you can just finish them off with your basic lightning attack. Makes Palpatine very, very good in those infantry situations, especially when you're on Death Star or those other tight corridor maps. That last one you want to look at is Emperor Palpatine's lightning drains less stamina, which is really good because you can hold his lightning for a lot longer, and it's more likely to lead to more kills. Then the only thing I would even recommend switching any of those out for is the each extra target hit by Chain Lightning reduces the time before the next time you can use it. I don't typically use this one too often because it recharges pretty quick on its own anyway, but that's one that I could see someone swapping out for. Now for heroes versus villains, you want to keep that Lightning Reach on. That you never want to take off, but you may want to swap out for the two-handed lightning attack, dealing bonus damage, since odds are you will have used Electrocute on the heroes. You want them to be stationary for as long as possible. And then you do want to keep that in full control because they have a lot more health. You'll want to be using your lightning as often as possible, so the more stamina you can have for the lightning, the better. And then the last one is the Forked Lightning. That just gives you a bigger area in which you can freeze those enemies with the Electrocute. And that's going to be it for Palpatine. Moving on to Iden. Oh, she's right there. And Iden's pretty simple, at least in my opinion, because, I mean, I've been using Iden from day one. I really enjoy using her, but she's not as powerful as the others because she hasn't really been tweaked as often. But the three that I use are the alternative methods, which just, I mean, you can see right there. Then droid batteries, which is really useful because that droid is going to be her lifeline. Like, she doesn't have a whole bunch of health, but she can get it back pretty quick. You just need to give her that time to heal. So the shield and then shocking enemies is very useful. And then the building less heat while firing, the the TL50 is an actual beast of a gun, and you want to fire that for as long as possible, so that's the card you'll want to pick. A card that I could see people swapping it out for is the increased area of effect when acquiring targets, but I typically will only use that in heroes versus villains game modes, just because usually if I'm fighting someone as Iden in a trooper game mode, I'm a little bit closer rather than far away. If I am far away, I'm using her pulse cannon anyway. So Kylo is one of those villains that I kind of use all of his cards. It just depends on the situation, and they're all good. You can't really go wrong with any of them, but if you're in a trooper-based game mode, you want to stick with his pull. You want to deal that extra damage with pull, and you want to have a bigger range when pulling people. You also want as much stamina as possible. So I will pick these three for trooper modes, and then occasionally I could swap them out for total control or solid freeze, and then that's just favoring that over his pull. But you want to focus on those two abilities, pull and freeze, because frenzy is good enough for the trooper modes. You don't need any additional help there. However, If you're in a heroes versus villains or showdown, you want to stick with his resilience, because your odds are you're going to be sticking with your team. You're going to be near other villains, so you want that boost. You want the damage reduction, and you also want the bonus damage that you can deal to the heroes. The next one you want to look at is the After Frenzy card. That'll give you 14 extra damage for 6 seconds. I know it doesn't sound like a whole lot, but odds are if you just used Frenzy, you're in a big puddle of heroes and villains and you're all just slashing at each other, that 14 extra damage can come in real handy, because that starts to add up with, let's say, 4 saber slashes. That's 14 times 4. That's a lot of damage you're doing extra, as opposed to not having that card activated. Then you still want to keep that Berserking Tantrum. You want as much stamina as humanly possible in those heroes versus villain game modes. And then the other one I could see possibly swapping out for is Closing In, and that just increases the distance of Frenzy. But again, Frenzy is good enough as is, and if you're using Frenzy, odds are you're pretty close to the heroes anyway, so you don't really need that card too often. But again, these are just my picks, so if that works for you, that's also a great card. Maul is probably one of the easiest ones now, because he used to be so good, and then they buffed him, and then they nerfed him, and now the latest update, they screwed him over. He's not even really a reliable villain anymore. But the cards I do use, at least in infantry modes, are the less damage from blasters. Then I like his abilities to recharge quicker, and then I like that extended reach that his accelerated throw, well, not the extended reach, the bonus damage that his accelerated throw will do. 20 damage, again, it doesn't sound like a lot, but because of the way they changed his lightsaber, he can throw it vertically now rather than horizontally, so it's a lot easier to hit people, and you'll hit them more often, whereas before it was really hard to hit people, so I'd say don't focus on that. Also, you want to stay away from his spin attack, not just in using it, but you also want to stay away from the star cards to upgrade it, because it's not a reliable way of hitting people. There's whatever they did with this previous update, you'll use that spin attack, and it looks like you go right through a trooper, and you do absolutely 0 damage and don't hit them at all with the spin attack. So it's not really a reliable, I guess, ability to use anymore because of the new update. So I stay away from these 2 cards at all costs, but the others you can't really go wrong with. They're all great. Now, if you're moving over to a Heroes versus Villains game mode where there's no infantry troopers, take off that damage from blasters, because typically you're going to get damaged from lightsabers a lot more frequently than the blasters. So you still want to keep that Fool Me Once card on to get those abilities recharging quicker, but you may want to swap out for the Chokehold throws enemies further away, because knocking an enemy out of bounds, and there's tons of maps to do it on, Kashyyyk, Naboo, the area where Maul died, you can push people over the edge there. There's a ton of maps where you can knock them out of the playing field, and that counts as a kill towards your team. So that 100% increased throwing strength is very helpful. And because of that, you also might want to consider Unrolled Grip, where it has an increased area of effect. The last one you may consider is the Furious Throw. You want to deal as much damage as possible, and again, we're staying away from the spin attacks. You can still use them, but stay away from the cards. And that's it for Maul. So Phasma, she's one of those villains that I don't really change too much. Even on the game modes, I swap out between, you want to have her turret as your lifeline. Like, that's what you're going to go back to frequently. So the more the better. I keep that on at all times, because it's kind of like the officer's infantry turret, but it's a little bit better than that. And then you also want the increased shock radius, because once you defeat 3 enemies while the First Order droid is active, then that shock radius is increased by 50%, and I believe the actual turret can shoot a little bit further away as well, like it'll lock on to enemies, but that range is already kind of crazy, so that's not too big of a deal. The one I do occasionally swap out is Blaster Inspection, which is it's a self-explanatory card. You go on kill streaks, and then you gain a permanent 3% decrease to blaster overheat. And it's not just you, it's your friendlies as well, which is very useful, especially if you're sticking with your team. One thing I want to say about the turret is now you can pick up the turret and move from place to place. So if let's say you've gotten that first one and you're up to the, or this second one's actually a better one, you're up to that 50% increased shock radius. If you want to move locations, you can pick up the droid, just make sure it doesn't get destroyed, then place it down again, and you'll still have that 50% increased shock radius. But if it gets destroyed and then you place it down once it recharges, you won't have that increased shock radius. You'll have to get it again, which it's not too big of a deal. It's not hard to get, but it is nice that you can pick it up and move. Back to the other cards I was talking about, though, you may want to swap them out for easy shots, because that 60% heat reduction is huge. Her gun is already crazy, but that 60% can help big time. And then you may occasionally swap out for not hard enough. I typically won't do that one too often because the damage reduction is already pretty good, especially with Survivor giving you extra health. But it's personal preference. Some situations may call for it, and then I encourage you to test them out yourself and see what works best for you. Moving on to Grievous. Grievous is probably the easiest villain to do. All of his star cards are incredible, but the three that I run without end are Flesh is Weak, because that 5% damage reduction gained is absolutely crazy. For every 10% missing, you start adding that 5% back for every, like, let's say he goes down to 100 health, or 10%, so he takes 90% of his health away. You would now have 5, 10, 15, 20, all the way up to 90% damage reduction, or not 90%, it's almost 50%. The point is, he has almost 1,000 health once you put that card on. Then his increased health regeneration by 100, he can go down to a very minimal amount of health and regain almost up to 600 of his health. And then it's like you've got a brand new hero again. Then Sith Trained is a great one, because that extra damage with his lightsaber makes a lot of infantry troopers one hit, and that 25% more stamina that he's using, it's not a whole lot of difference because he doesn't have a lot of stamina as is. He's very good at running away from a fight, coming right back, and then finishing the job. That goes for heroes versus villains, as well as Hero Showdown, as well as Galactic Assault. Every single game mode, I will use these three, and I can get massive kill streaks while doing it. Flesh is Weak is a really big one, though. It makes his health, I mean, he's like Vader. He can take a ridiculous beating, but as long as he gets away and survives, he's going to come back. Although he regenerates a whole lot faster than Vader does. Moving on to Dooku, who I've never really changed from the time of release. Some of his star cards have changed, sure, but he again is kind of like Grievous, where there's only a couple cards I'll use, and then I won't really change it up too much, just depending on game mode. But Sith Control, where he gets an extra 120 health regeneration, so that allows him to come back from a lot of tough situations that you might be put into without becoming a weak hero, that is. Then the Finesse, that's actually kind of funny, I didn't know that's what it was called, but it makes sense. Reduce stamina drain by 35%. That is crazy good, especially since it counts towards blocking and attacking. And since it doesn't specify, that means both saber attacks and bullet attacks. So this card I will rarely take off of him. And then last seconds, so I use his lightning stun very often. I don't actually use his exposed weakness too often, so I stay away from those cards. But Duelist, lightning stun, and then is of course regular saber slash are the big three that I use, so I want that to recharge as quickly as possible. The only one I'll even recommend swapping it out for is Masterful Duelist, and that's more of for heroes versus villains, but it'll also one hit a heavy if you have that equipped. But for me, I don't ever bother with it too much because he swings so fast when Duelist is equipped anyway that I don't want to say it's not worth it, but it's not really at the top of my list for must-have star cards. Now, you probably noticed the level is way higher than it was the last time I made this video, at least for the heroes, and that's just because I wanted to play around with them and see if he really just is that rough of a villain. And he is. There's only there's 3 star cards that I recommend that I personally don't take off. It's full reconstruction, that's that increased health regeneration. The linked systems, every 4 successful enemy stuns will increase its damage by 1 to a maximum of 8, which isn't a whole lot of increased damage with his shock prod. But then we've also got the faster, which that's the one I don't take off regardless. It doesn't matter because he barely does any damage to begin with. But then if you can double that damage, it does become a little bit more. And you only need to hit 2 enemies to double that damage. So it makes it a lot more worth it of an ability to use. Now the fourth one you could consider is Potent Bacta. And I mean, that one's self-explanatory as well. I don't really use that in Heroes versus Villains, but I don't really use him in Heroes versus Villains too often, so I don't get too much usage out of this card, but that's a situation in which I could see this one being used. And that's pretty much it. That's my list of star cards, the best ones for each hero and villain. I do hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to smack that like button. And if you didn't, let me know what else you'd like to see in the comments down below. But yeah, I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.